In this problem, we're asked to figure out what two numbers add to 8 and multiply to 15. Now, this first one, it may be very simple. You might be able to look at it right away and tell what it is, but I want to talk a little strategy for these that'll work for later ones that get tougher. And that is, I want you to focus first on the multiplication part of it, because there's a lot fewer ways to multiply to a given number than there is to add to a given number. And so I'm going to start by just thinking about all the different ways that I can multiply to 15. So I might think about 1 times 15, and then I'd think about 3 times 5. And basically that's it. And so then what I could then do is look to see if I add them up together, what do I get? And so notice the first one would give me 16, the second one would give me 8, and therefore we can see that the answer was the 3 and the 5 that got combined. And so my answer would be 3 and 5. And yes, we can go ahead and just put a comma between them in order to show that it's both. In our next problem here, we're figuring out what two numbers add to 11 and multiply to 30. So once again, I want you thinking about ways that we can multiply to 30. And go ahead and do it on your own first before I go through it with you here in a moment. So you notice I'm being kind of systematic about this, where I'm saying 1 times what would give me 30, 2 times what would give me 30, 3 times what would give me 30, and coming up with those. And then I get to 4. 4 doesn't work. 4 goes into 30 an uneven number of times. It's a decimal if we divide it. And so I'm not going to have one for 4. And then it would be 5 times 6. And after that, it would be 6 times 5, which is basically already represented here. So I don't need to do that one all over again. And so that tells me that I've gone ahead and found all of the options. And once again, we can then go ahead and figure out what would I get if I added each of these. And pretty quickly, you're going to find that you're going to be doing all of this stuff in your head, and it's going to go very quickly and instinctually. And that's what we're going for, is I want you to get to the point where you can just look at this problem and very quickly say, oh, it's going to be 5 and 6. And no, it doesn't matter if you say 5 and 6 or 6 comma 5. They both mean the same thing. But I want you getting to where this does start coming instinctually. And a lot of them will, but we're going to start seeing some wrinkles popping up as we go too. All right, let's do one more basic practice problem before we hit some of those wrinkles. So please first on your own figure out what two numbers add to 11 and multiply to 24. All right, hopefully you just came up with 3 and 8, because 3 times 8 equals 24, and 3 plus 8 gives us 11. Now, there were lots of other ways that we could get 24, but this is the only one that would give us the 11 when we added them up together. Now, if you are one of those that still is working on some of the combinations in your multiplication tables in terms of knowing those, definitely this will be also some encouragement to make sure you get that nailed down, because you really do need to know your multiplication tables for doing this kind of work. And yes, actually for everything we do, the better you know it, the more it's going to help you. So I would definitely encourage you, if there's still a few blind spots in there, you keep working on that. All right, on to our next one. Now you'll notice we got a slightly different wrinkle. So we're looking to see what two numbers add to 5, okay, no problem, and multiply to negative 24. So now we got a negative thrown in there for the first time. And so for our negative number, the only way that we can multiply to a negative is if we do a positive times a negative, or a negative times positive, because order doesn't matter when we multiply, right? So how can I get 24? Well, of course, 1 times 24 gives me 24, but I need to get negative 24. So I could get that either by doing 1 times negative 24 or negative 1 times a positive 24. So either of those options is going to work. And so I'm going to need to consider both as I go. And so once again, I can just think about all of the different ways that I could multiply to get negative 24. And when you're first working on one of these, or if you hit one that's giving you a lot of trouble, writing out the whole list like this will get you to the solution. It'll give you a nice ordered way of putting your thoughts together rather than random guessing and checking. You will probably find yourself doing some of that random guessing and checking, but as soon as you start thinking, dang, I don't know what it is, I can't find this one, then you're going to have to go to being orderly and actually writing some stuff out in order to be able to find it. All right, so once we know what all the different combinations are that can give us our negative 24 up here, then we just need to figure out which ones are actually going to add to the 5. So I'll add them all up together. And so we can now look down this list and we can easily see where our answer is. Because remember, we were looking to see which one added to 5. And we can see that happens right here. And so then our answer is going to be negative 3 and 8. Or you could say 8 and negative 3. But notice the negative has to be on the 3 and the 8 has to be positive. All right, now one other thing I want to make sure to point out as we take a look down this list here is that when we switch the signs, notice we also switch the signs on our sum. So when you add them up together, all it's doing is switching the signs. That will potentially be able to save you some time as you start looking down these, because really you could just do one of the combinations of the positives and negatives, and then if you discovered, well, I got a negative 5 there, but I need a positive 5. Okay, so that tells me I need to switch the signs. And so that is a shortcut way that you can get there, where you can see if I switch the signs on what I add, I switch the sign also of my answer. All right, on to a new problem now. Notice this one is having us add to negative 2 and multiply to negative 24. We are multiplying to the same number that we did last time. So if you took the time to make that list, all you need to do now is just look down that list for the combination that actually adds to negative 2 this time instead. So if we do that, then we can see that my winning combination would have to be a negative 6 and a positive 4. And so then that would be my answer, the two numbers that add to negative 2 and multiply to negative 24. All right, on to another one. Notice what we're looking at in this case. In this one, we're going to add to a negative 18, but we're multiplying to a positive 80. Well, if we follow our normal pattern and just think about, okay, let's go ahead and write out all the different ways I can multiply to 80 here. Let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to go ahead and write those out for you here. And again, you'll notice that I'm being systematic about it. I'm always going increasing one step at a time, and I just left out anything that didn't go into 80 evenly. So these are all my combinations. But of course, if I'm going to try to see what they all add up to, every single one of these will not be right, because remember, our goal is to end up getting a negative 18. And anytime you add a positive and a positive, you're going to get a positive. Well, that clues you into what your final answer signs will be, because the only way to multiply to a positive but add to a negative is if both numbers are negative. So rather than listing out the positive numbers that multiply to 80, we would then multiply out all of the negative combinations that multiply to 80. Now we know that the answer's got to be hiding in there someplace, so then we can go ahead and go down that list and add them up together. And by doing so, we can then see our winning combination. It ended up requiring a negative 8 and a negative 10 in order to be able to get there. And so those will be our answers. So notice, one of the things I really want you to get out of this problem is paying attention to the signs, the positives and negatives of our original numbers, and how those end up affecting the signs in our final answer as well. Because as you start noticing those things more and more, it's going to help you to find those answers much more quickly. And it's also going to help you develop your number sense, which is a lot of the reason why we want to be doing these types of problems, is to develop your number sense. Yes, it's going to be useful in a very particular skill that we're doing later, and it's going to be needed for that. But really, we're building up your fluency, your mathematical fluency. That is the ability to see your way through problems and be able to relate to numbers very quickly. This is now going to be the last problem out of this particular lesson. In this one, we're looking to see what two numbers add to 0 and multiply to negative 36. So in this case, we're adding to 0, multiplying to negative 36. What does that really change? Not a whole lot, actually. The fact that it's a 0 instead of a positive or a negative number doesn't change how we can approach it. I still want to start by figuring out what are numbers that multiply to negative 36. Now, of course, by now we've talked about, you're going to want to see how many of them you can just do off the top of your head. And a lot of these will probably just come to you, but if you don't, yes, you can always write out all the different options, because this is always a fallback in case you don't see what it is right away. So you always have this as an option, but you don't have to actually write them all out every time. Now, as I wrote them out, you'll notice I only ended up making the second number negative. I didn't write down, for instance, what we would get if we ended up doing -1 times a positive 36. That's because if I end up getting the wrong sign on my answer, I can always flip that in order to be able to correct it, like we were talking about before. So by writing out all of what we get when we add them up together, we can see our solution here, because that's the one that gave us 0. But I want you to notice something very specific about this particular solution. In order to add to 0, notice both numbers were the same except for their sign. The only way to add two numbers and get 0 is if they are opposites of each other. So for instance, in this case, it was 6 and -6, but in another problem, in order to add to 0, you might do 7 and -7. Or you might do 9 and -9, or any number and its opposite will always add to 0. So anytime that you see that you need to add something to 0, know that you're going to be having opposites. That is the same number, except one is positive and one is negative.